Hello again, students. It's calculations time with Dr. Dave. This lesson is going to be talking about significant figures. Now, significant figures are things that we look at when we measured something. In other words, when we take a measurement, when we weigh something, measure length and distance, we're looking at some sort of an instrument we measure, we write down a number associated with that. That's when significant figures comes into play. They're not talking about absolute numbers. So you're counting something or a given, meaning 7 days are in a week. It's a given. It's an absolute number, not something that is measured with an instrument. So, for example, here, if I said if I measured 425 grams of a drug in a balance, this would be a measured quantity. Right? So, if I did measure, if I had a balance and I measured out 425 grams of a drug, the question is going to be, well, how accurate is that? Right? How certain are we of that value, 425? Well, we're only as certain as the instrument that we're using to measure it, right? The certainty of that balance is really what it is. And the last value is typically looked at something that's an approximation when we look at how precise our balance would be. So let's look at some examples here. The significant figure terminology and what it actually means is you can read here. There are consecutive figures, right, that express a measured quantity, so that's something that we measured, right, to an accurate amount needed. The number is a measured quantity, the number of digits that we know to be accurate plus one additional that is uncertain. So the last digit is an approximate digit, so we're less certain about that last value, right? So there are rules for significant figures, and to make your life easier, every single number is a significant figure. The only time something is not a significant figure is right here. Is a zero show the location of a decimal point? So that means that if you see a zero in front of a decimal point, no matter how many zeros there are in front of a decimal point or to hold a place value, right, meaning to non-zero. So until you see a number that's not zero, those numbers are not going to be significant until you hit the number. Then after that, everything else, including zeros, will be. So let's look at some examples of what this means. Here we have a measured quantity, 16.5. So if I had a balance and I measured 16.5 grams of a substance, what is the number of significant figures? Every single thing is significant because there's no zeros, so that's 1, 2, 3 numbers. That's 3 significant figures. I go down to a measurement, 1.405. If I got that value on my balance, if I measure the number of inches, whatever that value is, it has 4 significant figures. Why? Because it doesn't start with a zero, and all values therefore are significant. That's 4 values. 4 is my significant figures. Here's a number, 0.85. 0.85 starts with a zero. So I have to keep going until I hit something that's non-zero. The next number is an 8. So that's significant, and everything else afterwards is significant. So there's 2 significant figures. This value is 0.00085. Notice, again, starting with a 0. I hit another 0, so not significant. Hit another 0, not significant. These are just placeholders. Now I hit 8, and now I hit 5. How many significant figures? Again, it's still 2. Let's look at it one more time. If I have 0.08050, I hit a 0, not significant. Hit another 0, not significant. I finally got a number that's not 0, it's 8, so I start counting 1, 2, 3, 4. That's my 4 significant figures. I'm going to come back to this one in a second. Let's look at 1,000. I start with a 1, so everything including the 1 is significant. So I've got 4 digits, 4 significant figures. Again, I've got a 0, so I have to wait till I get something that's non-zero. Still a 0, still a 0. Hit a 1 significant figure. This one right here, let's say you're doing some calculations and you are multiplying this ratio, so finding out how many minutes there are in 15.8 seconds. So if I took this as my calculator, I'd say 1 divided by 60 times 15.8, and I get this value, 0.2633 repeating. How many significant figures am I looking at? Well, when you're multiplying, you're looking at the least number of significant figures that you have in your numbers. Now, some people will say, oh, well, 1 only has one significant figure, so I should be rounding this to one significant figure. It should just be 2. But notice, like I said before, these are measured values that you're looking at. 15.8 seconds is the measured value. This 1 minute is 60 seconds is an absolute. That's something given to you. It's not something that was measured. So these are not considered in the calculation for significant figures. It's this value here, which has 3 significant figures, so you'd round that value to that number. These are summarized in rules. I will tell you, for this course and for most things that you are going to do in practice, you keep all digits, you plug all digits in your calculator, and you round the final answer. And I will say that one more time because you need to do it in this course. Anytime you're doing calculations in this course, keep all the values, consider everything to be significant, and you only round the final answer. Don't round in the middle of your answers. Wait until the end and round the final answer. Keep everything in your calculator. So the USP, which is United States Pharmacopoeia, which is a standard of practice that most states have, tells you that same exact thing. It says that you should keep all figures in your calculator and basically round to the last. Do not be confused between the difference between rounding a number to a certain number of significant figures and rounding a number to a significant number of decimal points. Most test questions, I am going to be asking you to round to a certain number of decimal points. So if you had a calculation and your calculator showed this value, 56.348719, and it said round to 5 decimal places, you would do 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. You would round that last value 1 up to 2 because you have the 9. And this would be your answer. If you said 5 significant figures, that would be 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. That 8 would turn into a 9. So notice the difference between significant figures rounding and decimal point rounding when being asked. For most things in the course, you will be asked to round a decimal, not to significant figures. Okay. Again, with rounding, it is generally considered that all calculations are completed and then you round at the end. Okay. In our calculations course, and in most things that you will encounter, most practices, when you hit the number 5, you round up. Anything less than 5, you keep. So what does that mean? If you have this in your calculator, 5.68, and I say round of the 1 decimal point, you would round that 6 up to a 7 because the number next to it, 8, is greater than 5. The typical things that most people understand for rounding. And the same thing if it was less than 5. So 5.63 rounded is 5.6 to 1 decimal point. If you're doing addition and subtraction and we're talking about significant figures, right? So if you had to add these values, this value plus this value plus, these two values together, your final answer would be this, 127.934. If you wanted to round, right, to 1 decimal point, you would have that 127.9. The reason why you would round to 1 decimal point is because you look at the least number of significant figures that you have, right? Least number of decimal points. Not significant, sorry. So the decimal point. You notice this one has 1 decimal point, this one has 3 decimal points. The least one is 1 decimal point. So your answer is going to be 1 decimal point. Let me clarify it one more time. When you're adding numbers together, look at the decimal point, the least amount of decimal points, which is 1 decimal point in that first number. That's what your answer will be rounded to, only to the 1. If you're abiding the rules of significant figures. In compounding, when we actually make prescriptions, we assume that everything we do is accurate. So we would actually keep this final thing. So usually in practice, you'll keep all those digits because we assume everything is accurate. But in doing significant figures, you will do that. If you're multiplying or dividing in significant figures, you keep no more than the fewest significant figures. So you've got 3.0 times 12.60. The least amount of significant figures in this case is 2, right? So your final answer we rounded to 2 significant figures. So multiplying and dividing, if you want to do significant figures, total number of significant figures. Adding and in subtracting, if you want to do significant figures, your final answer will be the number of decimal points that you see there. All right. So that is a lesson on rounding and significant figures. In the course, we will primarily deal with straightforward rounding that you are familiar with, and your answers being reported to a certain number of decimal points. Significant figures are important in certain aspects, but they are not heavily done in practice for compounding and in pharmacy, because we assume a lot that everything that we're doing is precise and accurate to get the values that we get during our calculations. All right. As always, this is the most important class because it's the only one that counts.